Everyone calls it overthinking. You've probably called it that yourself. You replay the conversation 17 times. You run every possible outcome of a decision before you make it. You second guess what you said, what you didn't say, what they meant, what you should do next. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that your brain just does this. That you are, at your core, someone who overthinks everything. I want to offer you a different explanation because overthinking isn't the problem, it's a symptom. And the actual problem is something almost nobody talks about. You're not overthinking, you're under-trusting yourself. And there's a difference between those two things that changes everything about how you try to fix it. Stay with me on this one. Overthinking is generally framed as a cognitive problem. Your brain is too active, too analytical, too stuck in its own loops. And the advice that follows that framing is usually some version of think less, meditate more, distract yourself, be present. But if you've tried all of those things and found that the loop just starts again the moment you stop distracting yourself, it's because you are treating the symptom and leaving the cause completely untouched. Here is what's actually happening. When you trust your own judgment, your own instincts, your own read of a situation, you make a decision, you live with it, and you move forward. You might be wrong sometimes, but you move. When you don't trust your own judgment, you loop, because the loop is your mind's way of searching for certainty that it doesn't believe is allowed to find on its own. You're not stuck because you're thinking too much. You're stuck because some part of you genuinely doesn't believe your own conclusions are trustworthy. And that belief that your own instincts can't be trusted didn't arrive from nowhere. It was installed, usually early, usually by someone whose job it was to help you develop confidence in your own thinking, who instead, intentionally or not, taught you that your read of a situation was wrong. They called it overthinking. But what you were actually doing was asking for reassurance that you'd never fully learn to give yourself. Self-trust doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops through experience, specifically through the experience of making calls, being given the space to live with those calls, and gradually building a body of evidence that says, I can rely on myself. But a lot of people never got that experience. They grew up in environments where their perceptions were regularly corrected, where they were told they were too sensitive, too dramatic, reading too much into things, where their gut feelings were treated as problems to manage rather than information to respect. Or they grew up with parents who were so anxious about outcomes that every decision, even small ones, was met with second guessing and worry. So the child learned to second guess too, not because they were naturally indecisive, because they absorbed the message that decisions were dangerous and needed to be checked and rechecked before they could be trusted. Or they were in relationships, friendships, romantic partnerships, workplaces, where their judgment was consistently undermined, where they were made to feel that their read of a situation was always slightly off, that they needed someone else to tell them what was real. All of these experiences produce the same result. An adult who has an enormous amount of intelligence and self-awareness, and almost no trust in their own ability to use it well. You didn't become an overthinker. You became someone who learned that their own mind wasn't a safe place to land. I want to tell you about someone. He was known by everyone around him as someone who always had the answer for other people. At work, friends came to him for advice. He was decisive, clear-headed, reliable. Nobody who knew him would have called him indecisive, but alone, making decisions about his own life, he was completely paralyzed. He could run a decision about his career for months without landing anywhere. He'd go around and around, listing pros and cons, asking for opinions, researching every possible angle, and still not feel certain enough to move. He assumed this was a character flaw, that he was simply not built for confidence the way other people were. What he eventually understood was this. He had learned growing up that his father's opinion was always the correct one. Every time he formed his own view as a child and his father disagreed, the father's view won, not through conversation, through certainty. His father was simply never wrong out loud in a way that left no room for his son's read of anything to stand. So he became excellent at understanding other people's thinking, and he completely stopped developing trust in his own. The shift came when someone asked him a question he had never thought to ask himself. Not, "What's the right decision?" but, "What would you tell a friend to do in this situation?" He answered immediately, clearly, without hesitation. Then he sat quietly for a moment and realized he'd just given himself the answer he'd been running from for months. He already knew. He just didn't trust that he was allowed to. So how do you actually build self-trust when it was never properly developed in the first place? First, start noticing the moment you reach for external validation before you've checked in with yourself, before you text someone for their opinion, before you Google what you should do, before you ask anyone anything. Ask yourself first. Sit with your own answer for 60 seconds before you go anywhere else. That 60 seconds is where self-trust is built, one small decision at a time. Second, track your instincts. Start a simple note on your phone. Every time you have a gut feeling about something, a situation, a person, a decision, write it down before you second guess it. Then check back weeks later. You will almost certainly find that your first instinct was more accurate than the conclusion you eventually talked yourself into after 17 loops. Third, make low-stakes decisions without deliberating. Choose the restaurant without asking for input. Pick the route without checking 3 alternatives. Reply to the message without rewriting it 4 times. These small acts of trusting your own judgment without seeking confirmation are the training ground for the bigger ones. Self-trust is not a personality trait you either have or don't have. It is a skill that was either developed or wasn't. And like any skill, it can be built at any age with practice starting today. If you are someone who loops endlessly before making a decision, I want you to hear something clearly. You are not broken. You are not weak-minded. You are not someone who simply cannot make decisions. You are someone who was taught at some point that your own judgment was not reliable. And you believed it because you were young or in pain or dependent on the person teaching you that lesson. But that lesson was wrong. Your instincts are real. Your read of situations is real. Your first answer, before the loop started, was almost certainly closer to the truth than the conclusion you eventually exhausted yourself into. The loop is not a character flaw. It is a habit built on a false belief, the belief that you cannot be trusted. And false beliefs, unlike character, can be changed. If this named something you've been carrying, share it with someone still stuck in the loop who hasn't found the words for it yet. And if you're new here, my name is Zoni. Subscribe. This channel is for the things you already knew but needed someone to say out loud. You're not overthinking. You just stopped trusting the one person who was always right, yourself.